Today, I'm going to take advantage of European regulations to steal money from airlines. Yes, I know I've started videos in ways that are a bit less what the fuck than this, but let me explain. Since 2005, if you take a flight in the European Union and it's delayed, you're entitled to compensation. For example, for more than 3 hours of delay, it's 400 euros for flights over 1500 kilometers. And the specific thing is that the amount of compensation doesn't depend on the price of the ticket. Which means that if you find a really cheap ticket, like for example with a low-cost airline, here for instance, there's a London flight for 25 euros, Croatia for 24.45, Iceland for 46 euros. If you think about it, a 10 euro ticket with a 10% chance of delay and compensation is technically worth 40 euros, 10% of 400 euros. If I pay 10 euros for the ticket, it's like I'm statistically making 30 euros. According to the law of large numbers, buying enough of these tickets should make me money eventually. So, in today's video, I'm going to try to develop an algorithm that allows me to predict how delayed a flight will be, and from that probability, I could calculate whether a particular ticket is profitable or not. I'm wondering if we can even calculate this probability, since a bird flying into a plane's engine and causing a delay is nearly impossible to predict. But if we look more closely, there are actually quite a few reasons for delays that can be statistically predicted. For example, this is a website that tracks all flight delays based on airports. And here, we can see that, for example, when it comes to on-time departure rate, Nice Airport performs worse than all the other airports in Europe. A departure punctuality of 34.9%, and that's just for the day. But if we zoom out and look at it over the course of a year, well, we still find the same airports with the highest number of delays. There must be some factors that explain this. If we train our algorithm on these factors, it could give us the probability of delay for each flight. If we look at the list, for example, the worst airport in all of Europe is Lisbon Airport with a nice delay rate of 31. Keep in mind that's over the year. Now, Nice Airport had a bad day. Maybe there was a strike. Maybe there was a technical problem. I don't know. But here, Lisbon Airport has a delay rate of 31% over the whole year. And when you look into it a bit, it makes sense. Lisbon Airport is known for being completely saturated. Today, it serves about 30 million passengers, though it was built for far fewer. And unlike other airports like Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, which was able to evolve over time by expanding outward a bit and adding terminals, they can't expand and they're stuck. They have to handle more passengers with the same amount of space. That means even the slightest disruption causes delays and things quickly become chaotic. So, to get back to our algorithm, one of the factors we can use to calculate a flight's delay is the departure airport. And while we're at it, in our algorithm, we'll also add the arrival airport. Here, for example, I can sort the airports by arrival delay instead of departure delay, and now we can see that the list of airports with arrival delays is different. Well, not completely different because Nice is still a disaster. I don't know what happened in Nice today. Apparently, they found 16 kilos of cannabis in the luggage of a passenger coming from Thailand. I'm not sure that's what caused so much delay. She tried her luck, but she didn't succeed. But here, for example, we see that Athens Airport has an arrival punctuality of 50% today. So just imagine you leave from Nice to go to Athens and, well, you exponentially increase your chances of being delayed. It doesn't work quite like that. It's not that simple, but you get the idea. Also, another key variable for our algorithm is the departure time. And to understand why, you need to take a quick look at how modern aviation works. A plane from a major airline doesn't just go back and forth between two destinations. It's not a shuttle. That would be too simple. What airlines do with their planes is that they generally make sure they serve 4 to 5 destinations in the same day. Now, I don't know exactly why they do that, but I think they have a very good reason. I think it must optimize the time the aircraft is in the air, because every minute a plane isn't flying, it's a plane that's not making money. It must also help better arrange the schedules of the crew, I suppose. And here, for example, I found a Ryanair plane that just today did Alicante to Stockholm, Stockholm to Alicante, Alicante to Lodz, Lodz to Alicante, Alicante to Vaxio, Vaxio to Alicante, Alicante to Oslo, and Oslo to Alicante. Wow, that's still 5 different destinations in one day. That's almost the same level as Taylor Swift's private jet at that point. But then, what happens if we find a flight where the plane goes through a series of airports that are all delayed? Mechanically, every minute of delay along the way will increase the delay by the end of the day. And that's why, if you ever take a plane. But I guess this also applies to trains or buses. I mean, I don't really know. Well, usually, it's the flights at the end of the day that have the most problems. I found this graph that shows the average delay time depending on the time of day. Here you can see that at 6 in the morning, there's very, very little delay. And then it increases a lot until 6 or 7 in the evening. And then, for some reason, I don't know, starting from 9 p.m., it starts to drop. I don't have an explanation for this phenomenon. My theory is that I think if there's too much delay at the end of the day, well, they just cancel the flights, and so that lowers the average delay, but it's just that the flight was cancelled. And for us, it doesn't matter anyway. If the flight is cancelled, we still get compensated, which is great. Alright, now we're starting to get somewhere. Also, keep in mind that the more parameters we have, the more accurate our algorithm will be. That's why I suggest adding the flight's airline to the list. Because if we look at the ranking, there are definitely some students who are worse than others. This is the official ranking of the most delayed airlines in Europe. We can see that the number 1 on the podium is Vueling. I think that's the Spanish low-cost airline. Then we have Wizz Air, then TAP Portugal, then EasyJet, then Transavia. So that's already some good news for us. Low-cost airlines often have more delays, which is interesting since we want the cheapest tickets. Still, you need to be careful with this kind of data. We're going to need a more robust model than just labeling an airline as more delayed. For example, looking at the top 3 airlines, we see TAP Air. Except TAP Air is a Portuguese airline with its hub in Lisbon. Yes, the worst airport in Europe. Are Lisbon flights delayed because TAP Air has many flights, skewing the average, or is TAP Air delayed due to many departures from Lisbon? We'll need to consider this when building our algorithm. The problem is, personally, as an unemployed YouTuber, I dropped out of school, which means that if I want to have a chance to make something that works, I'll have to dive back into the wonderful world of mathematics. I know I'll get criticized in the comments for making approximations, and people will correct me. I'll heart the most interesting ones. Well, in the end, after doing my little research, I think the tool that's best suited for what we want to do is something called Logistic Regression. Please don't leave the video, I promise it's not going to be too complicated. In statistics, Logistic Regression, or the Logit model, is a regression model mainly used in classification. Damn, I made a mistake. Okay, no, but honestly, my bad, I'm making this complicated. Basically, what you need to remember is that we're going to train an algorithm that, based on the parameters we give it, will give us a percentage chance that a flight will qualify for compensation or not. That's all you need to know. I'll skip the extra details since even I didn't get everything. I bought a book on logistic regression, and if I get 50,000 likes, I'll make a bonus unlisted video reading it with you. Yeah, I'm dumb. Anyway, by reading this book, one thing is certain. I'm going to need data, a lot of data. Specifically, I'll need the list of all delayed flights from recent years in Europe with the departure airport, arrival airport, time, and airline. Well, that's easier said than done. Getting info on 2 or 3 flights is easy. Getting info on millions of flights all at once isn't quite as easy. For example, here I found this dataset, European flights dataset. It's a dataset that apparently contains all the flights. The dataset is cool, but I can't tell if the flights were delayed, so I can't train my algorithm. It's useless. I found another dataset with all delayed flights over several years. Except when I looked at the data source, it was the American Department of Transportation. And the US obviously doesn't have the same rules about refunds as Europeans do. I think we're going to have to change our strategy for our flights. What I did is I focused more on sites that track flights live. Here, for example, I'm on a very well-known site called Flight Radar 24. These are all the flights on the planet live. That means all the planes you see here are currently flying. It's actually pretty funny to see that with the current geopolitical events. For example, there are no planes flying over Iran. Well, I don't know if it's funny, but in any case, it's interesting. Same for Ukraine and Belarus. In Russia, there are still a few. This site is funny because it's almost like a social network. For example, these are the most watched flights now, like a Twitch live stream. I don't know why it's doing these loops there. It's over Germany. But judging by the look of the plane, it must be a military aircraft. Honestly, it's really a nerdy site. I absolutely love it. They post lots of little articles with interesting facts. As a little anecdote, apparently the most watched flight in the entire history of the site is this one between Edinburgh and London. And that's actually the flight that brought back Queen Elizabeth's body at the time of her death. There were still 6 million people who watched that flight. I don't know what they were expecting. That Queen Elizabeth would die a second time in a plane crash? I don't know. Anyway, I don't want to know who these people are. You remind me too much of myself. It stresses me out. By the way, they have a blog full of nerdy data and interesting facts, but I'm getting off track. I'm mentioning this site mainly because it has the complete flight history going back to 2006. Now that's real data. I'll spare you all the trouble I had getting this data. They have an official application programming interface that you can pay for to get the data. The problem is, given the amount of data I needed, I think it would have cost me between $50,000 and $100,000. I'm not sure I could make that money back even with my little strategy. So I won't explain how I did it, but ta-da! This is a little interface I made to illustrate the data I managed to recover. So here you can see that I can actually choose the different airlines. I can uncheck the departure and arrival airports. Same for the times. Anyway, I really have all the information. So these are all the matching flights from June 2025 to June 2026. I didn't take all the flights since it would have been complicated to get everything. I did use some pretty specific filters. I focused only on the worst airports and flights departing after a certain time, yet that still totals 561,000 flights. I should add a feature to get the associated carbon emissions. Honestly, that would be interesting. Anyway, from there, that's where it gets interesting. I made a little script that automatically runs a logistic regression on the data I have, and it generates this ONNX file for me. Basically, think of this file as the equivalent of a PDF, but for machine learning. That means it's a file I've trained, but I can reuse it wherever I want afterwards. So I made a little interface that lets me enter all the information related to a flight. It tells me the chance of a delay long enough to qualify for a payout from the airline. That's it, our job is done. But no, you didn't think I wouldn't at least try. So to make my life a little easier, I went ahead and made a Chrome extension that, when I go on Google Flights, shows me the probability of delay and especially the expected value for each flight. Thanks to this extension, I can see how much money each flight brings me on average and compare it to the ticket price. If the expected value is positive, I buy. For example, I have the extension loaded here. When I search for a flight, the extension shows the estimated delay percentage. For example, for Lisbon to Berlin with Swiss Air, I have a 1.2% chance of qualifying for compensation. Then it calculates that the compensation is worth 400 euros. From that, it estimates the expected value for this flight at 4.67 euros. So given the ticket price, it's not profitable for me at all. There are percentages. For example, with Air France, it goes up to 4.6%. No, let's be honest, for a 200 euro ticket with an expected value of 18 euros, you really shouldn't buy that. Plus, look, there's a layover. If you skip the flight, they won't refund you since they'll know you missed the first plane. They always win. I'll have to research the most promising flights myself and see what happens. Honestly, I'm just glad I made something that works, or at least looks like it does. Now, does it actually work? We're going to test it. I'll share the Chrome extension link in the description if you want to try it. But so, what I did is I spent 1,000 euros on flights that in theory have a positive expected value. That means they're supposed to bring me back more than what they cost me. Paradoxically, the cheapest flights aren't the most profitable, and profitable flights are rare. Honestly, we really had to think hard. In theory, our 1,000 euros in flights should return 1,113, a 13% gain without effort. That's better than the stock market. It's not truly effortless. A delayed flight is only part of the problem. The rest is obtaining compensation from the airline. The problem is that obviously they're going to look for every possible excuse not to reimburse us. Looking at case law, we see that just buying the ticket isn't enough to get compensated. In fact, the European regulation considers that compensation is owed for the time lost, not just because the flight was delayed. Which means that if I wasn't actually planning to take the flight, well, I can't get reimbursed. So at the very least, for all my flights, I need to do the online check-in. You know, like it's 24 hours before departure. You have to fill in all that information, and that's when they assign you a seat. And even then, that's not always enough. Because ideally, I should at least go through security so that the airline really can't say anything to me. Except, well, all the interesting flights I bought leave from Lisbon, and I don't really have the time. I think, yeah, it's going to be complicated. Yeah, hello, Emil. How about a little vacation in Lisbon?
Yeah, well, it's not really convenient for me, but...
While we wait for Emil's answer, I need to discuss the limitations of my work. I know some of you might install the extension hoping to get rich, but it's likely not as great as you think. Well, first of all, the first problem is that the strategy we're using is pretty simplistic. We're literally relying on 4 parameters to try to establish a pattern. Except in real life, there aren't just 4 parameters. For example, what we could do is connect this to weather simulations to see if that could have an impact. We could connect it to the strike calendar, but actually that wouldn't be the most relevant because I think that in the case of weather and in the case of strikes, there's no compensation. So we should take that into account as well because, you know, we're training on data from airports that might have major delays, but they're delayed because of strikes, and so that doesn't result in compensation. Same, I'm not a statistician, I'm not an expert in this, so I probably had a lot of biases, a lot of things that make the model a bit broken, and, well, it's still very, very approximate, even just in terms of the number of flights we're tracking. Earlier, I mentioned 560,000 flights, but among those flights, there was a lot of incomplete data. For example, for some of them, we don't have the departure time. For others, we don't have the arrival time. So once we cleaned our dataset, there were only 260,000 flights left. That's still a lot, but keep in mind that's just flights from a single year. Maybe it would have been better to have data from other years too. A real-time learning algorithm that analyzes ongoing flights and updates the model might have been better. There are still many possible improvements. If we manage to be at least a little profitable on flights with Emil, that's incredible. It's incredible, and it could still just be luck. So what Emil did is he went to Lisbon for 3 days. He had 10 flights to test, and each time the goal was to check in online, go through security, and then leave through the official exit. This way, the airline believes Emil was waiting for his flight, so they can't dispute a refund. At least that's the theory, since Emil never boards the plane. Maybe they'll say yes, but you didn't board the plane. Then someone could reply, we didn't board because it would have made us too late. Anyway, I don't know. It's just a theory. But jokes aside, personally, I don't know if I would have had the courage to go back and forth like that in the boarding area, because apparently at one point, security gave Emil a bit of a hard look. Now, the moment everyone has been waiting for, the results. The first day we weren't lucky. Our first flight was Lisbon to Madrid, so our algorithm indicated a 39% chance of compensation, and in the end we had a 40-minute delay, which isn't bad, but not enough to request compensation. Note that the percentage shown isn't for all delayed flights, but only those delayed by 3 hours or more. Right now, a 40% chance with no delay is likely. Plus, there's another issue. The thing is, we mostly look at the delay at the plane's departure, but what matters under European law is the delay at arrival. And here, you can see that actually, during the flight, they managed to make up a few minutes of delay and it went from 40 to 31 minutes. And I think airlines must be playing with this by adjusting the duration of their flights. Okay, next, Lisbon to Bilbao was 25 minutes late, Lisbon to Milan was 40 minutes late, then Lisbon to Milan a second time was 10 minutes late, then 9 minutes, then 15. So delays are rising again. The Lisbon to Barcelona flight was an hour late, that's good, but not enough. And we also had a Ryanair flight to London that was an hour and 22 minutes late. So here, you can see that it's absolutely catastrophic. Our algorithm didn't work at all, or maybe we're just really unlucky. But that's not counting the luck we have with this flight, EasyJet flight 2462. It was a Lisbon to London flight that was scheduled for 3:45 p.m. and it took off at 6:48 p.m. 3 hours and 3 minutes late. That's it, we can finally claim our compensation. So from here, the process is relatively simple, and by simple, I mean really annoying. You fill out a form and wait for the airline's response. They'll likely look for loopholes, like claiming you didn't take the flight. If all goes well, we paid 111 euros for this flight and should get 400 euros back. We've completed the process and are waiting. They say it can take up to 2 weeks to get a response. Fine, but in reality, if we add up everything this project cost us, it's a disaster. In total, we paid 1,000 euros for flights. On top of that, we had to send a meal there to be eligible for compensation. That cost me 300 euros. I'm not even counting the costs of the databases I bought and so on. So for 1,300 euros, we got 400 euros back. That's not great. That's what I thought. But actually, when you look more closely, the flight really did leave 3 hours and 3 minutes late. But upon arrival, it was only 2 hours and 53 minutes late. We didn't gain anything. I have to make a confession. We didn't actually buy the 10 plane tickets. The truth is, I wasn't really confident in my model. Obviously, it was a good thing I wasn't. So, I thought that in any case, I was going to lose money, which doesn't really make me happy. And besides, I'm not going to have fun buying plane tickets for nothing. It was more for the experience. I would have been a bit annoyed if we had actually managed to make a profit, but there you go, just so you're aware. The journey is often more interesting than the destination. I believe this type of algorithm could work, but I also think there's a world where the airlines themselves have much more robust models. Because think about it, they have millions of euros at stake. They need to know that tickets must be priced to ensure profit. If they expect major delays, they should either cancel the flight or raise prices. I think it's theoretically possible to make money with this strategy. I think that in practice, it's very difficult. Nevertheless, if you like this concept and you want more, you know the drill. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, EasyJet. Bye everyone, Fuse here, see you next time. See you.